I am going to introduce to you now very briefly, and not doing her justice, Susan Ford Bales, who will introduce our speaker today. Susan is, of course, a trustee of the Gerald R. Ford Historical Legacy Trust and the Ford Presidential Foundation. She's a board member of the Rosalind Carter Fellowship for Mental Health, Betty Ford's Alpine Gardens Foundation, the Bosque School in New Mexico. She has so many achievements and locations of contributions to our society that I could really go on and on. But for now, we are going to ask her to be the introducer. So would you please come to the stage and help me welcome Susan Ford Bales.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Gail, for pitch hitting for Tom. I hope he feels better before tomorrow, that's for sure. He's got a big day, and so do I. So anyway, good afternoon. I'm always delighted to be back in Grand Rapids, but most of all to introduce our special guest. At times like this, my thoughts always turn to Dad. What would he think of our speaker's body of work? And how would Dad welcome our guest? One of John's prior speeches provides at least one answer. In October of 2010, John gave a magnificent lecture at the Danforth Center in St. Louis. And in that address, he spoke about the horrible divisions and bitterness in our nation's politics and in our public discourse and in many and religious faiths, without sugarcoating any of our current challenges. Nevertheless, John spoke of hope. Quote, "It would be wrong to give up hope that things can get better, our conversations more civil, our culture more tolerant, and our politics less hateful. The simple acts of reading, of contemplation and discovery, of writing poems and finding cures, and creating symphonies is for the religious an act of piety and of thanksgiving. For the secular, such things may be about the wonders of nature, or perhaps of rationality or of logic. So be it. In either case, America's story is about moving forward through the darkness, searching for light." End quote. John, President Gerald R. Ford would have agreed with every syllable of your expressed hope, every single one. So this year, John has once again turned his considerable and unique talents toward the presidency, this time one of Dad's most distinguished predecessors. His newest book, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, is an exceptional biography, and John vividly and candidly presents the personal life and leadership skills, the good and, yes, the uncomfortable ones of America's most accomplished politicians and founding fathers. So it is with personal pride that I introduce the gifted thinker and most definitely one of America's most outstanding presidential historians. I do so knowing that if Dad were with us today, he would join me in warmly welcoming our guest to this very special place called Grand Rapids. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. John Meacham.
Thank you so much, Dr. Bales. Unless they re-voted or something for the afternoon. It's all downhill from here. That was wonderfully gracious. One of the great pleasures of my journalistic life, I'm now a recovering journalist. I have my 30-day chip. We have support group meetings. Was being blessed with the company, being able to be in the company of President and Mrs. Ford on a number of occasions in the late 1990s and early part of the 2000s. President Ford was incredibly generous in talking to me at various points, some anniversaries. We had a conversation about the fall of Saigon, and I did his remembrance of that incredible moment, and he, with characteristic generosity, wrote me a note, which I keep on my desk, actually, which refers to that as that saddest of days. And not many presidents who preside over controversial moments are actually candid about the content of those moments. There are not many presidents who would openly refer to something as in acknowledging its human and emotional content. And Gerald Ford was unquestionably in a very small class of American presidents who called them as he saw them and saw them right a heck of a lot more often than he didn't. And so we honor his service and the legacy that you all are so wonderfully continuing here. And I just got to say it, boy, could we use him right now. It's it's really remarkable. I've been out for 3 or 4 weeks now talking about Jefferson. And one of the first questions, there are 2 questions you get right off. One is people say, well, a lot's been written about Jefferson. And I say, wait, I was misinformed. This isn't the first book. Like Rick in Casablanca. And the second question is, what can we learn now? What would he do about the fiscal cliff? And so, well, you can't really rip him out of context. But I said, not too long ago, in an era, President Johnson, for all his manifold outsized characteristics, shall we say, one thing about politicians is they're all like us, only more so. But not that long ago, a single man rose to the presidency because of his capacity to act in a principled, pragmatic way. I mean, the rise of Gerald Ford to the presidency is a remarkably American story of the centrality of the virtues of acknowledging that you might not have a monopoly on truth. And to take, and what I love about President Ford is he is a master legislator, was master at pushing us through helping us lead us through the Cold War and the most remarkable economic expansion in history. Remember, the building of the American middle class after 1945 was the single greatest moment of the spread of opportunity and the creation of wealth for the broadest number of people, including the spread of liberty with the civil rights movement, really that the world's ever known. Even after Gutenberg, it took a long time. That was a burst of creativity, and Gerald Ford and his generation were right in the middle of it, and pilots of it. But sometimes you have to do things that aren't all that necessarily popular. Compromise often gets you through and maximizes your popularity. But what President Ford did when he truly ended the long national nightmare in September of 1974 with the pardon that I think unquestionably cost him his job in 1976 was one of the 2 great moments of utter political courage in the last quarter century. The other, I believe, was George H.W. Bush, who broke his no new taxes pledge and memorably said, it's no longer read my lips, it's read my hips, as only he could do. Read my hips. And he knew then. He said in his diary that day that he had probably lost re-election. Gerald Ford, with the pardon of his predecessor and the attempt to start a new chapter in American life, George H.W. Bush in an attempt to impose a fiscal discipline that did not last and that the consequences of which we are living with right now, also did that and lost his job. And I wish we had more people now who were willing to make those kind of existential choices. And so it is with enormous humility and gratitude that I'm here today. I always start in talking about Thomas Jefferson by pointing out that there are some things that are perennial in life, and partisanship is one of them. So I want you to put yourselves, if you can, in New York in 1790. Thomas Jefferson has just returned from France as the American minister. He has become the first Secretary of State. He's moved to the capital of the new nation in New York. He could not find rooms, as he put it, on the Broadway, so he had to take rooms on Maiden Lane. And he immediately goes to war with Alexander Hamilton. And they are, as Jefferson put it, daily pitted in the cabinet as two cocks, constantly at each other's throats, debating fundamental questions and not so fundamental questions. Again, politics doesn't change that much. Jefferson used to be driven crazy because Hamilton had a separate channel to the British diplomats. And, you know, for those of us, this may be true in some of your lives, that it's the smallest of bureaucratic annoyances that loom largest. Even at the creation of the country, basically, people were throwing fits about not being the first to know something in a chain of command. So they're debating fundamental things, they're debating little things. It's driving George Washington crazy. So Washington writes them both a letter, asking them to knock it off. That's a technical historical term. I don't want to get too fancy here at lunchtime. I was in Los Angeles last week, and Bill Maher, the very moderate political commentator, was interviewing me at the LA Library, and it was fun. I like doing Maher's show, partly because it's filmed in the Price is Right studio. And so you're there, and like that big wheel is over there, and the golf, and you know, it's kind of fun. It's literally called the Bob Barker Studio. So he was late, and so I told the group, well, he's clearly at choir practice. But I started a sentence with the word, well, historiographically, Bill, and he said, please don't ever do that again. That's just, even for you, that's too dorky. Which I insist on taking as a compliment. But, historiographically speaking, Washington writes a letter to Hamilton and to Jefferson. And he says this: how unfortunate it is that whilst we are beset on all sides with insidious friends and avowed enemies, that we are being torn by internal dissensions that are tearing and harrowing our vitals. Tearing and harrowing our vitals. There are a couple of things about that phrase. It's very vivid, it's tactile, it clearly shows that Washington cared deeply about what was going on. It's also memorable. Not a lot of phrases that George Washington ever uttered were memorable, so it's a unique thing there. Here's how well it worked. Jefferson wrote back about the illegitimate son of Nevis, Alexander Hamilton. I will not suffer the slanders of a man whose history, from the moment at which history can stoop to notice him, is a tissue of machinations against the liberty of the country, which has not only received him and given him bread, but heaped its honors upon his head. So that Dr. Phil moment didn't quite work out. Hamilton wrote back saying that Jefferson was a fanatic in politics and an atheist in religion. And in that era, in that moment, an anonymous letter writer wrote to Jefferson, I think you ought to get a damn kicking, you redheaded son of a bitch. So, I know a lot of people want to think that Karl Rove started all this. I know that Karl Rove wants to think Karl Rove started all this. It's been with us forever. Partisanship is a perennial force in the democratic experiment. Jefferson shared briefly the founder's vision that there would be an amalgamation of parties. By the time he had been president for about 2 or 3 years, he gave that up, saying that men had divided themselves into parties by differences of opinion over whether the interests of the many or the interests of nobles should predominate, since those questions convulsed Greece and Rome. So Jefferson looked all the way back and saw this as a perpetual issue. It could be managed. It could be ameliorated. That's what Gerald Ford did. It's what George H.W. Bush did. It's what Dwight Eisenhower did. But it could not be done away with. Because if we don't have conflict that breaks along partisan lines, that means we're in an absolutist society. And the central work of Thomas Jefferson's life and the ongoing work of everybody in this room is to continue to ensure the survival and success of a Republican, sorry, lowercase r, experiment in self-government. And we forget sometimes how remarkably new that idea was at the time of the American founding. Now, I want to be clear. I don't think the founding should be used as a historical antidepressant. I don't think that because nothing can happen now, we should look back and just think, oh, if only we could be like them. Because you know what? We're a lot more like them, and they're a lot more like us than either side would probably like to think if they could. What we have is a culture of contention, and where greatness lies, where political greatness lies, is in the banking of the fires of that contention. Because you're never going to put that fire out, because if you put that fire out, that means we all agree, which in your heart of hearts, you know we never will all agree. What it means is that we either have a king or an absolutist culture, political culture, that enforces the sense that we all agree. So unless you want a monarchy or a hereditary aristocracy that totally agrees with you, we have to live in a partisan world. We have to find a way to manage it in a 60-40 kind of way. And life, at least my life, and I suspect yours too, is kind of about 60-40. Sometimes there are moments where there is a 100% call. President Ford's call in September of 1974 was one of those. President Bush's in 1990 was one of those. FDR's in 1940-41 was one of those. Abraham Lincoln's was one of those. But those are the moments that are the exception to the rule. And we are incredibly lucky when we have the right people in the right place to make those calls in those exceptional hours. The greatest politicians, the greatest presidents, are the ones who can do both, who can manage and govern in seemingly ordinary times by making the deals we have to make to keep the Republican experiment going, and yet have the capacity, when the crisis comes, to make the hardest calls of all. And the presidents we talk about and the presidents we remember, and that one president whose legacy clearly is so alive that he brings you here now in President Ford, are those who can do both. Here's a game to play in the car. This is one of the reasons my children don't like to travel with me. Can you make a list of great American presidents who did not combine these two things? A skill of articulating an ideal, a vision of where the country should go, and yet also had the capacity and the legislative and deal-making skill to bring that ideal closer to reality. They're two very different skill sets. Visionaries are philosophers, they're preachers, they're professors, due respect. They're not necessarily politicians. Politicians know how to trade horses. They know how to trade bridges, sometimes to nowhere. They know how to make things work. They're two different things. A lot of really good legislative mechanics around, a lot of good visionaries. It's when you get someone who bridges those two human capacities. And Thomas Jefferson, I believe, was the greatest such figure in the early republic. At the time of the Revolution and in the tumultuous years that we don't spend as much time with, because I think the popular historical memory tends to go from 1776 to George Washington. You might stop briefly at Andrew Jackson just for a moment I'd appreciate it if you would. We Tennesseans have had a rough time recently in presidential stuff. All the way, and then you get to Lincoln. And it doesn't help that Lincoln now looks like Daniel Day-Lewis. That's not helping my guys. Best thing that ever happened to Abraham Lincoln was having Daniel Day-Lewis. But Jefferson was there managing those two skills and able to do that. And so I want to talk about him as a politician for a minute. And I want to think for a second about why is it that he resonates so? People don't talk this way about John Adams or George Washington or even Alexander Hamilton. I want to point out, by the way, just for the record, that my guy didn't get shot in Jersey. So there's that. The critical question is what makes a historical figure endure? And Jefferson, a 19th century biographer, once wrote, if Jefferson is right, then America is right. If America is wrong, then Jefferson is wrong. Now think about that for a second. That's a hell of a burden to put on one person. You don't hear it about Washington. You don't hear it about Adams. You don't hear about Hamilton or Madison. But you do hear it about Jefferson. And so why? My theory is that it's because we either consciously or intuitively understand that Thomas Jefferson represents the best of us and the worst of us. He articulated a promise of human liberty in the middle of a revolutionary struggle that we continue to fight to fulfill. And he was hopelessly hypocritical and failed miserably to bring that promise into full reality. He was, in other words, a human being. I believe that the characters, the figures who resonate, are not those whom we see bathed in a heroic light, but those we see in daylight. To continue this series of metaphors, I believe that we learn more from people we try to look in the eye than if we look up at them uncritically or down on them self-righteously. And what I tried to do in this book is to look Jefferson in the eye. And here's what I saw. I don't want to freak you out. It's not that I really thought I was staring at him. There's a moment in every biographer's life when you turn into Jack Nicholson in The Shining and you run around with an axe wondering why you're doing this. And it's okay to talk to your subjects. It's when they talk back that you get in trouble. But here's what I saw. The best of Thomas Jefferson was that he did not believe the life of the mind and the political life of the nation should be separate. He was coming of age at a time when century upon century upon century of the assumed authority of priests and princes was falling apart. For millennia, people were expected to accept what they were told on faith as revelation or as coming from a divinely ordained king. The work of the scientific revolution, the work of the European and Scottish Enlightenment, was to flip that round, to take, and the work of the Protestant Reformation as well, to flip it around in a way that suddenly, instead of the focus of existence being on those in authority, the focus became on the individual. That suddenly we were in charge of our own souls, of our own destinies. We could choose our own economic path. We were not trapped by the circumstances of our birth. That was the Enlightenment idea. Now, unquestionably, in that era, we're talking about white people. We're not talking, they were not broadening it to all women. They were certainly not broadening it to slaves. That was all part of the painful, bloody, but ultimately redemptive process which American history has unfolded. But we can't judge them by our standards. That's not fair. So it's remarkable enough what they did in that moment. And Jefferson believed that these ideas weren't just for a university. They weren't just for William and Mary in Williamsburg, where he was. They weren't just for the University of Virginia, which he created. They weren't just for the salons of Paris, where he was. They weren't just for after the political session ended in Philadelphia or New York or Annapolis or Baltimore or Princeton, where various congresses met, or Richmond. They were for every day. They were for every moment. Because the American experiment was about giving political manifestation to these ideas. That if a people did not think for themselves, a king or a dictator would soon step in and think for them. History was full of this. America was the exception, not the rule. No republic had survived. Look at Rome. Jefferson said that men should be participators in politics not only on election day, but every day, and that those who did so would rather have their heart plucked from their living body, rather than submit to a Caesar or a Bonaparte. It's a vision, a holistic vision of politics and public service. You can't outsource the political life of a community or of a country. It doesn't work. And once you outsource it, it tends toward an absolutism of the people who pay the most attention to it. This was a fundamental Jeffersonian insight. And so he wanted to make a world where those ideas could go into action. Something else that was hugely important and very much resonates, I think, in the life of President Ford. Jefferson believed intensely in the idea of sociability, that you and I had to, if not love each other, I don't want to get too weird, we had to like each other. We had to believe that our fates were linked. Because if we didn't think that, then why would I pay taxes for your kids to go to school? Why would you pay taxes to take care of my health care? Why would any of us give money to guarantee the equality of opportunity for someone who needed it if we had already taken advantage of it? How do you make a democracy work if we don't see that a rising tide would lift all of us? The great American promise is of human equality, but it's also of equality of opportunity. And you only are going to support someone else's equality of opportunity if you believe, if you like them, if you believe in them, if you see a common human bond. And this isn't some sort of 4th of July thing. This is deadly, pragmatic political business. Jefferson totally believed in it. In a very specific level, he believed in it in Washington. Every night during the congressional session, he had congressmen down to dinner. Every night. He would write his daughters beforehand saying, I'm about to become an unpunctual correspondent because he was about to go into this zone. But he believed that if other lawmakers, other stakeholders, as we would call them now, in the system, if they heard his program from him, if they came to like him a little bit, then they might, on the margins, support him. And politics is decided on the margins. It worked in many ways. John Quincy Adams said that there were many critics of the Jefferson administration who had been silenced because the doors of the president's house had been so open to them. There's a wonderful story about a Federalist senator from New Hampshire who came down to Washington in 1803 believing that Jefferson was the devil incarnate, because you had to believe that as an article of citizenship in New England in those days. It's a little like, just quickly, that the same held true for Andrew Jackson. It is said that in the middle of the 19th century, a New England Sunday school teacher asked who disobeyed God and conceded to gave in to the serpent. And the school child immediately said, Andrew Jackson. So they've had some problems up there. We need to work with them on it. The senator came down from New Hampshire, hating Jefferson. Spent 6 years doing this round of dinners and being with Jefferson. By the end of it, they're exchanging pecan recipes. They're handing each other seeds. They're talking about how their grandchildren will swing from the limbs of trees built by this great relationship. It's sociability. It was Jefferson making himself not a distant character, but a real figure in the life of that political culture. And it's not just about the political culture, but it's about all of our communities, all of what Edmund Burke called the little platoons. We have to be engaged if we want all of this to work, because otherwise history tells us it's not. And that's not a homily. It's just a historical reading of what's happened in the long history of the world. Now let's talk about the worst. You can't have it both ways if you're me and believe that Thomas Jefferson, who was in office from 1769 until 1809, more or less constantly, and who from 1800 to 1840 either was himself President of the United States or a self-described Jeffersonian, held the office for 36 of those years, an unmatched dynasty in American life. Jackson didn't do it, Lincoln didn't do it, FDR didn't do it, Reagan hasn't done it. You can't have that and not hold him to account for not managing and marshaling those political skills to do something about the great American original sin of slavery. Thomas Jefferson's life was totally made possible by slavery. His first memory as a child was of being handed up on a pillow to a slave on horseback to be taken on a family journey. One of the last things we know that happened to him is he was in his alcove bed in Monticello, which I'm sure many of you have seen, and he was uncomfortable. And he's trying to signal to his white family what he wants done. And no one understands except an enslaved butler who comes over, fixes the pillow, and he's comfortable again. From the beginning to the end of his life, slavery made him possible. As a young man, he tried to reform the institution. As a trial lawyer, a young lawmaker, and as a member of the Confederation Congress, he lost each time publicly and clearly. And there are two things I think we all know that politicians don't like, and that's losing publicly and clearly. In 1784, in his most significant moment, he tried to prohibit slavery in the Northwest Territories, in his version of the Northwest Ordinance. By the way, don't you love a life where at noon on a Friday you're talking about the Northwest Ordinance? That's why I think you'll play that card game. He lost by a single vote in the Confederation Congress. He said, in predictably wonderful Jeffersonian way, no one ever spoke in better needlepoint pillow phrases than Thomas Jefferson. He wrote that heaven itself in that moment was silent, but for the lack of one voice, the fate of millions still unborn hung in the balance. It's a goosebump kind of quote, isn't it? But that was 1784. He had another 25, 30 years of active political power, and he never returned to the issue. He just couldn't do it. He did not see a politically viable way forward. Now, were there the voices of abolition and emancipation that rose in the swelling chorus in the 1830s, 40s, 50s? No. Again, we cannot judge them totally by the standards of our time. But if he tried early in his life to do something about it, nothing had changed when it was later in his life. And so we can't let him off the hook. He's on it, and he's staying there. He is, therefore, an amazing hypocrite. He's also a human being. And I believe we have to take him all in all. Again, if we want only to learn from saints, it's going to be a very short class. So, Arthur Schlesinger used to say that self-righteousness in retrospect is easy, also cheap. And I agree with that. And I think that the moral utility of history, if you will, is that we should look back, note the sins, omissions, and failures of the past, and try to apply them to our own time. That is, what is unfolding now, where a moral contingent is making a case for reform of a public policy that is being resisted by a mainstream of Americans for reasons of economic, political, or cultural convenience. I can think of about 6 right offhand, and I bet you can too. So we can feel superior to Thomas Jefferson. That's fine. But I would urge all of us to try to use that experience, not simply to make ourselves feel better about ourselves, but to see, can we do something about what we can control in order that 40 years from now, posterity will not look back on us and say, how exactly was it that you let X happen? I can do it in my native region right now. 40 years ago, in the life of my grandfather, who was born the same year as President Ford, served in the Pacific as well. He was a judge in Tennessee, lawyer, but he lived through a period where, until 1965, African Americans were being asked at polling places to tell white poll workers how many flakes of soap were in a box of detergent or they wouldn't be allowed to vote. 40 years ago. So I think if anything should check our self-righteousness, it's that. And you know that, and we know between whether it's inequality, the worrisome, I think, trend toward the failure of more of the future of the equality of opportunity in this country that was so prevalent after World War II. I think we all know that that's in trouble. I'm not suggesting there's all one government solution or all one private sector solution. Gerald Ford wouldn't say there was all one or all the other. It's always a combination of both. It's always a little bit of Jefferson, a little bit of Hamilton, as much as those two would dislike that. We have come through the storms when we have reached out and when we have become stronger, the wider we've opened our arms. And again, this is not feel-good rhetoric. This is a historical reading of moments of crisis in the American experience and how we've gotten through them. I think because he had such a good box office, we should give Lincoln the last word. In 1859, Abraham Lincoln was invited to deliver a Jefferson birthday address. He couldn't do it, but was reflecting on the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And so reflecting on that phrase, he wrote the following letter. This is the year before he was elected president. He said, "All honor to Jefferson, to the man who amid the concrete pressures of a struggle for national independence of a single people had the coolness, forecast, and capacity." The coolness, forecast, and capacity, I love that phrase, to embalm into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men and at all times, that today and in all coming days it should be a stumbling block, an obstacle to the very signs of reappearing tyranny and oppression. Not a bad legacy. Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we have a minute. A couple of questions? Yes, sir. It was. The gentleman's asking about the Adams-Jefferson relationship. They represented such different visions for the country. They had, this is my, I don't want to blame this gentleman for my phrase, they were the great frenemies of American life. Sometimes they loved each other, sometimes they wanted to slit each other's throats. I have some friends like that. I'm sure you don't. I'm sure you're better people than I am. And the relationship through the years. They were revolutionary colleagues. They first met in 1775 in Philadelphia. Jefferson had just come as a delegate to the Continental Congress. He arrived with the reputation of a masterly pen. He'd written a document called A Summary View of the Rights of British America the year before, which was an early statement of colonial strength, printed by a woman in Williamsburg, and it went wide, as we would say now, went viral, as we would say now. So much so that Jefferson heard and wore as a badge of pride that Parliament had put out a contract on him. He was terribly disappointed later in life to find out that that wasn't true. He, 1776, the Declaration comes up, and Adams says Jefferson should write it. And Jefferson says, well, why don't you write it? Adams was 8 years older, I think. And again, all of life is politics. This is a subcommittee hearing, by the way. The Declaration of Independence is the world's most famous subcommittee report. That's what this is. And so Adams says, Massachusetts, I'm paraphrasing, Massachusetts is seen as too much in the forefront. They were the real firebrands about breaking away. Virginia was a little more moderate. Pennsylvania was a little more moderate. And there were a couple of states that were unsure. So Adams wanted a Virginian to write it for political reasons. And so Jefferson goes to that house, Jacob Graff's house. He was a bricklayer, sits in his little suite, writes the document. It's edited well, actually. Jefferson never wanted to admit that, but it was there were some good fixes to it. And there it went. John Adams, I think, regretted that moment almost more than any other in his life, because he didn't think the Declaration was going to be quite as important as it was. And he later just said, you can almost feel the enamel coming off his teeth, said, the Declaration was a theatrical show and Jefferson ran off with all the glory of it. Plus ça change. I think they were together in Europe as diplomats. Jefferson had a wonderfully flirtatious kind of relationship with Abigail. I would have been scared to death to flirt with that woman, but he also once wrote, this just popped back in my head, he also once wrote Abigail and John's daughter, whom he liked very much, Nabby Adams, who had asked for some girdles to be sent from Paris to London, where the Adams were. And Jefferson wrote that he'd gotten a certain size because there are ebbs as well as flows in human affairs. So they were pretty close. I don't know if the Nixons ever sent you anything, but it's hard to imagine President Ford asking President Nixon to send Mrs. Ford, underwear. I think it's safe to say. Maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they all were closer than I thought. So there was a great intimacy, and then in the 1790s they fall apart because Jefferson believes that Adams has joined this Hamilton-Washington wing that tended more toward monarchy. And he was vice president. Ford John Adams ran against him for president. No one except John McCain has had that many problems with the vice president. There you go, all right. It takes a minute at this distance, but she never disappoints. And then in 1813, 1814, they begin this remarkable epistolary relationship, one of the great series of letters. You should just read them straight through. It's 158. They're brilliant. If anybody thinks they're the first draft of those letters, I think you're wrong. They knew we would be reading them. They saw them as Ciceronian. And they're wonderful. And Adams is always trying to refight political battles. Jefferson doesn't want to do it. He says, we should not be like Priam of old, putting on the armor of party. And then they die on the same day, weirdly. And I wonder, I'm torn on this. Do you think Adams would be upset to know that his headline got stepped on, or would he be pleased that it was a double billing? I don't know. That's the third thing for your car ride home. One more and I'll let y'all go. Yes, sir. Yes. It is indeed a date which will live in infamy, but as FDR said, but the American people in their righteous might shall win through to absolute victory, was the speech he delivered on the 8th. As I'd mentioned before, my grandfather fought in the Pacific, as did President Ford, and many here, I'm sure. How many veterans are here? Yeah, well, thank you all. We stand on your shoulders. We stand on the shoulders of your sacrifice and on those who did not come home. And remarkable, extraordinary that the greatest global event, it seems to me. Here's your fourth game. Sorry. I once tried to think of it. So, what if you wanted to do this? What are the 3 or 4 largest events in human history? One is the passion of Jesus of Nazareth, unquestionably. Whatever you believe, from whatever tradition you come from, that's how we tell time. And so the power of the Christian story and the Christian institution is, to my mind, probably the most important event in terms of all of its implications. And the second, I think, is the Second World War, that for the United States began today in 1941. Because at the end of that, we suddenly had the power to end all of human life because of the splitting of the atom. And so many, many people in this room have lived through one of the most remarkable eras ever. And it's an enormous privilege and burden all at once. So I should say, and I'll leave you with this, so we on time. I have two memories. I'll end where I began with President Ford. I have two central memories of President Ford. One is the first time I was ever taken into a voting booth was in 1976 with my father as he voted for Gerald R. for Michigan in Tennessee. And by total happenstance, obviously, I was in Vail with your parents for one of these historical interviews on the day in 1998 when my grandfather died. I actually spent the morning with your parents, went back to the hotel, found out that my grandfather, who sort of raised me, had died, and went back, as he would have wanted, I went back and finished the interview. And I said, "It's been an interesting morning since I saw you, sir." And President Ford told the story, I'm sure he told it 1,000 times, basically saying that if Harry Truman had not made the decision he made, he would not be sitting there. And my grandfather was in the same kind of position, and I probably wouldn't be here either. And so it's a reminder there was a man who had had the ultimate responsibility at the height of the Cold War, controlling those elements that had been created during the Second World War, but whose life had been spared by one of his predecessors' courageous decisions. And so all of this is what's so wonderful about history, is it's all right here. It's contingent, it's improvisational, it's ennobling, it's scary, but it's what we have. Thank you all very much.